Today, orchids can be bought in almost any flower shop for a very reasonable price. But just 150 to 200 years ago, Europe was gripped by a true orchid craze. A single orchid flower could cost a fortune. Trading these exquisite creations of the tropics promised fabulous wealth. And so, people set off by the thousands to the southern latitudes hoping to return with treasure or not return at all.
The
The
first
first
victim of
victim
orchid
of
fever
this
was
orchid
England,
fever
brought by
was
navigator
England.
James Cook to the Duke of
According to one
Devonshire.
version of events, the infection was brought to the Old World by none other than the legendary navigator James Cook. In 1775, returning from his second voyage around the world, Cook presented the Duke of Devonshire with a vivid specimen of untamed tropical beauty, an orchid, and the Duke was lost. Orchids became his obsession. He spent an entire fortune outfitting expensive overseas expeditions. Thanks to his efforts, a tropical greenhouse appeared in England, 4,000 square meters filled with flowers, earning the Duke of Devonshire the reputation of owning the finest orchid collection of the 18th century. But rivals soon emerged. Europeans could not resist the striking beauty of exotic flowers. One of the Duke's most serious competitors was the famous millionaire Rothschild, who assembled an impressive orchid collection of his own. Like his rival, he sent ship after ship to the southern tropics. Demand grew so intense that it eventually gave rise to a new profession, the orchid hunter. These collectors were, of course, very far from science. Yes, they traveled across South and Central America, explored Africa and Asia, Madagascar and Colombia, pushing into the most inaccessible regions of suffocating tropical forests. But true naturalists, let alone botanists, were almost non-existent among them. Their fanaticism had a simple explanation: the rarer the orchid, the more money it brought. Most were ruthless dealers like the legendary Benedict Rosal, nicknamed Iron Hook. This Czech orchid hunter became a living legend. He was robbed 17 times, each time losing his entire haul, yet he returned to the hunt again and again. He didn't stop even after losing his left arm in a clash with indigenous warriors. A metal hook replaced his hand, and Rosal learned to wield it skillfully, cutting orchids from trees with it. In total, he discovered over 800 new plant species and shipped more than 1 million plants across the ocean to flower companies in England and Belgium. According to contemporary accounts, a successful orchid hunter could earn £2,000 to £3,000 per season. Some, however, sold their finds directly to wealthy collectors, and then profits multiplied many times over. A single orchid could buy a house. As demand continued to rise, prices soared. In 1886, a Colombian orchid cost £150. Just 25 years later, that figure had increased dozens of times. What had once been a risky occupation turned into a deadly one. Tropical fevers, malaria swamps, poisonous snakes and insects, leopards, and poisoned arrows were joined by new dangers: sabotage from competitors. Espionage, intrigue, bribery, and fraud flourished in this refined world more lavishly than the orchids themselves. The fate of orchid hunters can be judged by the story of a man named Oversley. He worked for the famous Sander and Co., a gigantic greenhouse complex that turned the unremarkable English town of St. Albans into the world capital of orchid production. A railroad was even built to serve the greenhouses. Its owner, Frederick Sander, began as a seed merchant but later switched to orchids and never regretted it. By the late 19th century, Sander's collection was unrivaled. It was worth enormous sums and cost many human lives. According to official records alone, 7 flower collectors died in the jungle. No one seemed troubled by this fact. The public demanded orchids. Oversley was sent to Peru in search of a rare and beautiful flower, the Cattleya orchid. For 7 months he searched. At last, he succeeded, collecting several crates and preparing to return home. But then disaster struck. "I barely escaped," Oversley later reported to Sander, "One of my assistants was shot in the head, another fled, and I was left alone." Sander replied calmly, "Go to Chile. I hope you'll be more economical this time." From Chile, Oversley sent his employer 17,000 specimens of Cattleya orchids. Just think about that number, 17,000 plants. Orchid hunting in the 18th and 19th centuries bordered on outright barbarism. In one expedition alone, 8 tons of plants were collected. Hunters often concealed the locations of their finds and deliberately destroyed remaining plants or altered greenhouse conditions to ensure competitors would get nothing. As a result, this trade caused irreversible damage. Many orchid species were wiped out completely, while others still teeter on the edge of extinction. Why import flowers in such industrial quantities? Because orchids stubbornly refused to survive in European greenhouses. England was even called the graveyard of orchids, so many plants died during transport at sea and later in greenhouses. Despite being imported by the ton, orchids remained rare. In 1804, the Paris Botanical Garden had only 7 specimens. Berlin had 7 as well. Vienna had 11. Leiden just 3. "Collecting orchids is as exciting as playing the stock market," wrote H. G. Wells, an avid orchid enthusiast. "It is a kind of speculation. Before you lies a shriveled brown root, nothing more. Perhaps the plant is dying or already dead. Or perhaps it will prove to be a priceless acquisition, slowly unfolding before the delighted owner into a treasure, transformed by an unusual curve of a petal or an exceptional delicacy." This stock market speculation continued until the early 20th century, until growers finally abandoned attempts to create tropical conditions by force. Once they lowered greenhouse temperatures and allowed fresh air to circulate, a miracle occurred. Orchids not only survived, they bloomed. Years of failure were needed for growers to realize that excessive care had been the true cause of their troubles. But once orchids ceased to be luxury items, interest began to fade. The era of the great hunt came to an end, the fever passed. Today, orchids remain enormously popular. Even by the most conservative estimates, annual global sales of greenhouse-grown orchids reach around $11 billion. The industry is especially well developed in the Netherlands, Thailand, the United States, and Taiwan. Modern greenhouses are highly automated. Computers monitor temperature, light levels, humidity, and soil composition. As a result, orchids pose few problems and are surprisingly affordable. Still, true connoisseurs are willing to pay any price for rare specimens. Orchids imported from Colombia and New Guinea, such as Appendicula, Bulbophyllum caducea, Dendrobium forbesi nalexis, and Oberonia, can cost astronomical sums. Serious collectors are ready to pay up to $50,000 for a single plant. And judging by these wealthy buyers, it may be far too early for orchid hunters to retire.